Hello and welcome to another episode of Charles Weekly Party. Now, I do have a couple of things that I'm really looking forward to talking about today, even though the general theme of the episode might be a little bit not seeming like something you'd be interested in. But before I get started with that, let's roll the intro. Alright, so we've all heard the good old saying, the only things guaranteed in life are death and taxes. And while that's, for lack of better words, it's a very accurate saying, I think it pours death and taxes in a very negative light. And, well, taxes, I could say, probably should have some degree of negativity when you have to go through the work to file them. That doesn't mean that they are the worst things in the world, and they bring out a little bit of interesting usage of technology. But following my usual pattern, I like talking about architecture, and then I like talking about technology after I've talked about my architecture. Hope I said that right. But long story short, how on earth do death and taxes relate to architecture and technology? Well, let me get started on that. And I'm going to start off by basically saying death and taxes, architecture and technology, they all connect together. Now, I'm going to get started by talking about how death and architecture relate, or at least in this particular scenario. So, I'd like to talk today about a crematorium in Amalsad, India, that's known as the Udan Crematorium. So, what the Udan Crematorium is it's a crematorium located in India that basically, for lack of better words, reimagines the traditional crematorium concepts. Now, when you think of crematorium, what do you think of? You're probably thinking of sort of a cold place, nothing really special about it, and how it's, for most scenarios, at least on American soil where I am, the cremation process is something that happens behind closed doors. You say goodbye to your loved one, then the cremation process happens, and one day you have a body, and another day you have ashes in some sort of urn or other container. And to that respect, because it's all sort of inside, there's no real connection to nature. And I've talked about it again and again, how architecture and nature sort of go hand in hand. On a site, architecture is supposed to go and mess around with the nature that you see. And when I say mess around with, I mean not necessarily mess around with in the aspect of I have to make everything just right. It's a factor of taking the existing nature to the best of your ability and bringing that into connection with the site. So basically you could be taking and making decisions for what goes on the site based on the site itself, and this is no particular exception. So, because the site that this crematorium is on is slanted, it goes and takes advantage of that by having a split level design. And before I go any further, all of the pieces I mentioned before about what we think of a crematorium to be is, in this particular case, turned on its head. So the reason I say, and part of the reason I say that is because this is in India, where society and religion are very much intertwined. So the cremation process isn't something of, as I mentioned before, having the whole thing happen behind closed doors. For this, it's the cremation is basically the funeral that ends up happening. And it's changed over the years in the ways that the ceremony used to be handled. However, as it is today, it still has quite a few connections to the original way that the society that we're talking about here handles it. So, and when I say society, I do mean the people who are local to the locals of the area where this crematorium is. So, going back to the split level design, each level actually has a different purpose. So the top level is designed as the public space, and the lower level is designed as the private space. So locals are invited to utilize the upper area for reflection, meditation, and possibly remembrance gatherings. However, the lower level is more designated towards the cremation process and reserved for that and the administrative tasks that go along with that. So between the two levels, there are multiple connections that sort of intertwine the two. Now, the big connection between these two levels is a ceremonial sort of path that's a pretty large ramp that combines the upper level and the lower level. And the reason I say that this is a ceremonial path is because this is the path utilized for cremation ceremonies. I don't know the exact name of them, but for clarity, I'll refer to them as cremation ceremonies. Now, there are also stairs that connect the two levels for other purposes. So when you obviously you don't always use the main ceremonial path for everything, and you want to keep that reserved for more ceremonial purposes. So having something else along the lines of stairs is always useful for that. And I'll get around to part of the purpose of the stairs later on. Lastly, there's a winding meditation path that actually goes and takes advantage of the sloping site. However, just one thing to note about it is that it doesn't actually connect to the cremation space, and that's quite deliberate. So one can go to the site and meditate without possibly disturbing a private cremation ceremony that's actively going on. So before as much as I'd like to continue talking about how the top level works and all that fun stuff, I'm going to talk about the serious matter of the cremation spaces, which is the primary purpose of the crematorium. So, the lower level features 2 hexagonal cremation areas. And these 2 cremation areas are separated by the aforementioned ceremonial ramp. So, what that allows the crematorium to do is have 2 ceremonies going on at the same time, while also allotting to each family their own privacy and reflection space that doesn't connect or interfere with the other. And I recognized pretty quickly that having 2 ceremonies ongoing where you run into people who are from a different family, therefore a different person, that can get to be a little bit awkward. So funeral homes, I know, do a pretty good job of having generally speaking, to have different areas of the building that can be used for reflection. However, and sometimes having a larger space that can be separated into smaller spaces via operable partitions or basically movable walls. But this crematorium actually does it a lot better. The 2 are they're connected, yes, but they allot complete privacy to the family witnessing the cremation of their loved one. Now, the ceremonial ramp, when it opens up on the lower level, opens up to a plaza sort of area that has a statue of Shiva. What that's supposed to represent is the sort of separation between materiality and spirituality, if I can get the word right. Now, time and time again, I've looked at several. I'm remembering back to my history classes. To some degree, all religions have a separation of materiality and spirituality, pointing out how materiality can interfere with spirituality. So, exploring that in Hinduism is also the case. It also finds that to be the case. And part of the purpose of having the statue there is to also convey the understanding of the natural life cycle, and also conveying the spiritual life cycle, and how the spiritual life cycle follows your soul and not your materials. So, I'm going to say this as carefully as I can, because I do not know all of the details of of Hinduism. However, I'm going to try my best to convey the understanding that I'm pulling from the way the architecture is done and from what I've read. So if I am not 100% on point, I apologize in advance for not having that straight. So having a cremation ceremony symbolizes the difference, the elimination of the materiality of that life. So, in Hinduism, I'm well aware that there's the belief of reincarnation. Can't remember all of the terminology, but at different sort of levels, doing good gets you to a better level, doing bad in life gets you to a lower level. However, in order for a soul to traverse through the reincarnation cycle, there does need to be a shedding of material possessions. Having the cremation ceremony helps convey that the soul would be set free from the material body it was attached to. And having that separation is something that I think provides closure to people the cremation ceremony itself provides closure, but it also provides a reminder that you only have so much time in life to do good. And regardless of what religion or none, or even if you don't have a religion, that thought process, that mentality of you only have so much time to do the best that you can, applies to all of us. So, to complete the spiritual representation of the statue, going back to that sort of plaza at the end, there is a golden trident to complete the atmosphere of the separation of materiality and spirituality, having the statue at one end of the plaza and the trident at the other end. And that having that is sort of what sets people into the mindset that they need to be in for the ceremony when they proceed from that plaza to the cremation area. So both of the hexagonal cremation areas have an area so that the family can gather around while the cremation process occurs, but it also provides a reasonable opportunity for reflection, or for private reflection, and for consolation. So I mentioned before that both of the hexagonal areas are on opposing sides of the ceremonial ramp. However, across the entire site, those are the one set of elements that are completely handled symmetrically, with the statue and the trident providing the line of symmetry, so that each of the cremation spaces provides the appropriate connections, or has the same connections, that each of the spaces is equal, private, and I'm at a loss for words here. Making sure that neither of the spaces feels better than the other, which I know is a shortfall to some degree of the sort of the American or standard American funeral home. How those that can support secondary spaces often operate that in such a way where it's quite obvious that one space is primary and another space is secondary. And for those that have it, having a tertiary space. And stripping that sort of hierarchy can really, I think, really helps, because especially for the closest family who generally end up handling the service or whatnot, or being the most impacted by the service. At no point do you want them to feel that because someone else is having their ceremony on the same day, that your space is, or that the space that your family has is not the best that facility has to offer. So removing that, I think, is very, very useful. And personally, I feel should be incorporated into any new sort of funeral homes that are being built, so that no one feels that the space that they got wasn't the best that they could have. It is time to sort of lighten the mood up. Because, and I'll speak from my personal experience here, but initially after the passing of a loved one, the first however long, depends on each person, it ends up being a mournful period of sadness, period of reflection, and for some people, much more intense grief. After the sort of mournful period is generally a reflective period and a celebratory period. And not celebrating the fact that the person passed on, but instead celebrating the good that happened during their life. So it goes without saying that for many people, yes, there's a whole bunch of the funeral and associate or whatever ceremony ends up happening. So in this case, cremation ceremonies is generally a very sad time. And that's usually when you need the tissue boxes. You have a lot more hugs, a lot more comforting, and a lot more consolation. And it's necessary at that first stage of mourning. However, once someone has passed the stage of primarily mourning, they're able to go and remember the good parts and enjoy or have happy memories with their loved one or friend. And that top level of the crematorium really helps provide that. So I think it's and I'm going to go here and say that having the higher level being the reflective level also goes and associates with the moods. So at that initial mourning stage, you feel low, you feel sad, you feel down. However, eventually, with enough with time and consolation and comfort, someone is able to go to a more reflective state. They go back up to where they were. Not necessarily fully back to the life. Once someone passes away, especially someone who's close to you, life is never going to really be the same as it was before. But you're going to be back up to to a state of being able to go about your daily life without the constant thoughts of the person who's passed away on your mind. So having that reflective space on top helps remind everyone as they proceed away that things get better. Life won't always be sad. You have happy moments and you have sad moments. And without the sad moments, we wouldn't necessarily be able to as easily value the happy ones. So that, I will say, that ended up being a lot more reflective than I was necessarily intending when I started off recording this episode, but I feel that it was important nonetheless. And that really connects to the way the architecture is done here. This entire complex is devoted to the connections between life and death. The reflective cycles, and having the gardens on top are 100% intended for public use. They're not intended to only be used at certain points of time or by reservation. They're there so that the local community can use it and can reflect and gather. And this happens by multiple ways. So you do have the areas of simple public gardens, reminding visitors of the overall simplicity of life. And I know it's hard to believe that life has a degree of simplicity to it, but it does. And there is a children's area so that those with children can go in one spot, while those who are old enough to understand a lot more of the gravity of certain situations, able to be on their own without distraction. And one of the biggest areas on this site for the connection, or for the reflecting, what's the word for it? Of the reflective gardens, and not reflective as in reflecting pool, but reflective as in mental state of reflection. There's the one area that takes full advantage of the natural slope of the site. So what that space does is, throughout the site there are multiple you have some paths that wind and some paths that are straightforward. And aside from the primary ceremonial path, which has a wind to it and at the end gets straightforward, to one side of the site you have a path, a sort of path that goes down to another statue reflecting area, but you have two paths that go to it, and they're separated by the materiality. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they're fully separated, because they are actually, there's a winding path, and then through the middle of the winding path is a straightforward path. So what that serves to do is point out that there are multiple paths in which to go. But life, you have the start of your path when you're born, and you have the end of the path when you die. And that the two paths show that for some people it is a very long and winding road with all the curves and the bends, the twists and the turns. And for some people, it's a very straight path. But having the paths intertwined also provides the capability where you don't have to stick to one path or the other. Sometimes, and also goes back to the way life is operated. Sometimes there are the twists and turns, but other times things are straightforward. And the hybrid nature of these paths serves as a sort of reminder. It's not stated there explicitly on a little sign, but it's more of the sight guiding the mind, how you can choose your path. But no matter which path you choose to get to that garden at the end, you're going to get eventually to the garden at the end. So no matter what life has in store for you, you're going to start here and end here. And the garden does it in such a beautiful way. I know for a lot of people, it's not, myself included, it's not fun to think about death and dying, but to think about life. And I think this whole schematic of the site is allowing the connection between life and death and helping people to value the time across a life. So I did mention that I would talk about the stairs that provide a little bit more of a direct connection. And before I finish up talking about this, I will point out that they are there for a very deliberate reason. So on both ceremonial sides, you have staircases that provide much more direct access, following a sort of straight path. And that is put in, those straightforward paths are in place to allow for the time following a ceremony to proceed away from the space of sadness and into the space of joy without hindrance. And also, by having the separate staircases, if there are two simultaneous ceremonies, it prevents the aforementioned awkwardness of possibly running into someone or running into people from the other ceremony at the same time. So providing that little degree of separation. Now, I did start off the episode by saying that the whole theme of this was death and taxes. Now, I've spent a decent bit of time talking about death and how death and architecture can work together, and architecture can help soothe the pain that's often associated with death. And when I say help soothe, I mean there's a specific way that things need to be handled, and utilizing the elements of architecture to help that, or one of the most, using architecture to help soothe, comfort, and console is one of the most noble things it can do. Unfortunately, not much can be done to soothe, comfort, and console people when it's tax time. However, taxes and technology are very much intertwined nowadays. So, with the world's overall increasing reliance on technology, taxes have been no exception. And what I'm going to talk about today is the technology, or lack thereof, of of tax forms. Now, everyone's fully aware of federal taxes. No matter which state you live in, you're going to have to work with those taxes. Now, for some people, or for a lot of people, I should say, there is an additional component to these taxes, or for tax season. And that additional component is state taxes, or local taxes, where in those areas that, or in the areas that actually use those. So, for the income taxes, there are tons of forms. Yes, there are ways of doing it electronically, filling all of this stuff out digitally, but before all that existed, you had the good old-fashioned form. And for some places, the form has advanced, and for other places, it hasn't. So, thanks to the way a PDF works, you can run into any combination of those. And I recently got to work with someone who dealt with basically the 3 different types of tax forms that you could have. So, thankfully, taxes on the federal level are done in such a way where you have a form that can be used in one of 2 ways. Either you can go on your computer and type into all of the fields utilizing, because Adobe created the PDF file format, utilizing Adobe's software allows for the smoothest experience. But that federal form you can take and use on, if you have the free Adobe Reader software, you can take federal tax forms and go on there and fill in the proper fields with the proper information. I think all except for the signature field, which for obvious reasons is still preferred to be done by hand. Now, the federal form you can also use, let's say you're savvy enough to utilize a computer, but you're not savvy enough to work with the fillable PDF form. On the federal forms, that's not a problem, because they support you can just send it to your printer, and from there, fill out the forms by hand and mail them in, just as it was before all the computer pieces, all the computer components existed. And I know normally in times of pre-COVID, the way taxes worked is, at least for where I am, if you head to your local library, you can get the instruction books and the tax forms if you're filling them out by hand that way. However, in times of COVID, I know the library that normally had those did not have any of them at all at any point in time. So, for these states, not for the states, I'm still on federal. So, for federal taxes, you can do either. And I will say, if the local library is open, let's say they don't have the forms and you need to use online, or get online forms so you're not savvy enough to do it, I'm sure someone at the library can help out with that. So, you may have to pay a couple cents for the cost of the printouts, but it's to be expected. Because, unfortunately, as I'm very well aware, ink toner, paper are not free. Definitely don't grow on trees. So, as nice as that federal form is to provide a choice, unfortunately, that's not always the case. And I do say unfortunately because having the choice is actually ideal. Because let's say my handwriting isn't the best, I can fill it out digitally and not have to worry about someone having an issue not reading the form and then getting an audit afterwards. Well, to solve that problem, some states have forms available on their websites that need to be filled out electronically. So what that means is you have to have a PDF program that is capable of properly handling the fillable forms. And for that, I will say Adobe Reader is free, but just when you go to download it, make sure that you pay attention to the checkboxes, because otherwise, if you just click that download button, you'll get other software with Adobe Reader. And I know when I want to download Adobe Reader, I only want to download one program, not 3. So, but anyway, that free software was actually necessary is actually necessary to complete some of the forms, because it says in red letters on the side of the document, no handwritten entries. And the directions say specifically for the particular state I was looking at, the directions specifically said, thou shalt not, well, not verbatim, but long story, rough translation, thou shalt not write on the form except to sign it. So if you wanted to handwrite that form, you were not supposed to, because that's what it says you're not supposed to do. And last thing you want to do is try and not listen or deliberately disobey instructions from a tax office and land yourself an audit. For those states that do have electronic forms like that, that can prove to be a hassle as well. But that's not the only thing or scenario that you could end up with. Let's say you live and work in 2 different states. And one of the biggest examples of that ends up being New York City, where countless people commute from the surrounding states of Connecticut and New Jersey to go and work in New York, which means for those very commonly for those, or for residents of those 2 states, New Jersey and Connecticut, you have and I'm not saying this is exclusive to those regions. Any time you live and work in different states and each state has taxes, you often need to file taxes in both states. So, hence, running into different forms. So, as convenient as it can be to have a choice, I mentioned having one form where you need to do it electronically. There are other states that have forms you can download, but you need to print out and fill out. And you can't just go into into your PDF software and type in all the details. Instead, you have to print it out, do all the calculations by hand, and have fun that way. And if you wanted to go and try and fill it out, even if it isn't designed for it, I checked one particular state's forms, downloading them and using it with a paid PDF software. When I say paid, I'm talking about Adobe Acrobat Pro, which is what is used to actually create many of these PDFs. The fill and sign technology was very stubborn in not working with the form. I could not, no matter what I did, I was not able to get the software or the automated or the technologies in fill and sign to work well with the form. And I don't know what to say about that, but personally, if you have the ability to create a form, you should be able to create a fillable one. So I think having the option is crucial so that no matter what, people can go and fill in or complete their taxes in a way that's that's convenient for them without or to reduce the overall frustration of taxes. So we have the technology to do it, and I'm just going to say right now, if you have the technology to do something to make people's lives easier, by all means, do it. Someone will thank you. So, to conclude, I hope you enjoyed this interesting episode of, I guess the best way to put it is, a much different take, or taking the common thing of there are two things in life you can't avoid: death and taxes. Well, nowadays there are two things you can't avoid in life are architecture and technology. In some way or another, all four of those are going to be around, and you're going to interact with them for the majority of people, you're going to be interacting with that on a daily basis. So, hopefully, the architecture and technology in your life is pleasant and helps you make the best of things. I know sometimes, or I'm very well aware that sometimes technology doesn't work, and it has happened even in some of the recordings of this podcast. As I was just saying, sometimes it happens in the course of recording this podcast, and just as I finished saying that, the camera decided to, on its own, stop recording. So, yeah, happened another time, so I don't know what's going on, but hopefully this doesn't run into any further issues because, well, point proven, technology doesn't always work. Last but not least, I hope you benefited somehow from this episode. I know death and taxes aren't always uplifting, are almost never uplifting, but hopefully with changes in the way we do things over time, we'll be able to make those less bad, I guess is the best way to put it. So, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes of the podcast. And if you go to anchor.fm/CharlesWeeklyParty, you can find all episodes of the podcast, as well as the ability to interact by leaving a voice message. And you can also support the podcast if you'd like. So, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to leave a review. And if you want to see the action, then you can always watch that on YouTube. I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill off this episode now, but take care and roll the outro.